All right, let's talk about designing with type. And this is whenever you're creating an entire layout, with blocks of text and headline fonts and all this kind of stuff. This is what you need to keep in mind. You want to, whenever you're looking, when you want to step back, whenever I'm designing, I really don't even pay attention to what the type is saying, because I'm looking at it from a graphic perspective, from a visual standpoint. So you want to take, the same things into account, that you would when you're designing with shapes or colors, because this all applies to type. I see a block of text as just that, a block. So I want to use things like, balance, visual balance, and negative space, things like that. Like if you have one block of text, one column, and it's over here on the right side of the page, with nothing on the left side, then that's just going to visually draw your eye to that block of text. It's going to give it a little more emphasis. And if you have uneven columns, like if you have one column that's this long, and then the next one is this long, and then the next one is this long, it's going to create this kind of ragged visual idea. So you just need to pay attention to that, kind of step back from your design occasionally and just squint and see how it really looks. When you're designing, let's say you're doing a page layout for a magazine or something. You generally, a rule of thumb is to use 2 or 3 typefaces maximum for any kind of spread. You usually want, I say 2, especially when you're starting out until you get comfortable with the way these fonts interact. You have one for your headline, maybe a sans serif font like Helvetica, a bold or something, for your headlines and your subheads and call-outs and things like that. And then you have your body font, which is usually a serif font. Doesn't have to be, but typically it is. And then you might throw in a third font for a call out, or you might want to use a third font for subheads. But generally you want to exercise some restraint when you're using fonts, because you don't want it to be when there's too many fonts, it kind of all bleeds together. Your brain doesn't really know how to process all these different things. There's no organization. Whereas you might have, if you have 3 fonts, your brain processes, okay, this is a headline font, this is a subhead font, this is the body font. Whereas if every paragraph is in a different font, your brain's like, why are all these different fonts there? I can't really organize this information. All right, a little bit about how type breaks. And what I mean by that is the words at the end of the line, how they kind of break to the next line. There's different kinds of this. Most type is ragged, just because words are not going to automatically end at the same point at the end of the line every time down. So there's generally some lines are a little bit longer than others, and that's called a ragged break. There's also something called the justified break that a lot of newspapers and some magazines use, where the space between letters is automatically either shrunk or expanded to make every line end at the same space. So each line is exactly the same length. And that's good when you're looking at it from a distance, but when you look at each individual line, some words are squished together and some are spread out. It creates this kind of uneven rhythm that's kind of distracting sometimes. And also when you do that, when some words are too spread out and some are squished together, it creates what's called rivers. And rivers are just these white spaces that when you look at a block of text, they kind of connect, and at each line there might be a white space. Down here there's a white space, and it kind of creates these jagged white lines throughout your text. It just kind of, it doesn't look very good. So I tend to shy away from justified text. I like the jagged edges, because that also creates this interesting contrast between the straight line on the left side and then the jagged edge at the end of the text on the right side. But there are times when justified text would be useful, when you really, from a graphic element, you really want this kind of square block of text as opposed to something else. A little bit about indents and spaces between paragraphs. And this is this has really progressed over the past 20, 30 years. If you remember older versions of Microsoft Word, whenever you hit enter, it would automatically indent the next paragraph. And that was just kind of the default setting. Now, when you hit enter, it doesn't do that. It doesn't really indent paragraphs. It just kicks it down an extra line or puts a space in between paragraphs. And all this is, there used to not be paragraphs at all when the type press was first introduced. It was just blocks of text. And paragraphs were introduced to kind of help you organize what you're reading and separate ideas into different, chunks of information, I guess. And the spaces between paragraphs, whether you indent or space them, it just makes them easier to read and process, creates these nuggets of information as opposed to just a huge overwhelming page of words. So it's kind of up to you, personal preference. I tend to like the spaces between paragraphs and not so much the indents, but that's my own personal preference. Let's talk about your assignment real quick. You have two parts to the assignment. The first part is, kind of what we've been doing. I want you to look through some ads or articles or, pretty much anything. I've been a little too narrow when I say just advertisements in magazines. That's very readily available, easy to find. But you can use magazine spreads, newspapers, stuff online. I tend to shy away from just because it's typically very similar, just because of HTML, the way that it's designed. But if you can find examples of printed stuff online, that's a good resource, whatever you want to. But anyway, I want you to find 3 examples, whether that's a magazine advertisement or an article spread, a 2-page spread in a magazine, or something you found online, whatever. I want you to find 3 examples that use typography in an interesting way, whether they play around with the letter forms, or use different colors to get a point across, or whatever it might be. Find something that strikes you, and then I want you to examine what they did and what they achieved by doing that. Did they use words to create an idea? Did they play with the letter forms and take certain parts of a letter away? What kind of feeling does it create? So I want you to write a paragraph about each one of those examples, 3 examples. The second part of the assignment, and I'll go more in depth on Blackboard so you can read about it. The second part of the assignment, we're going to play around a little bit. I want you to visually represent 5 words using type. And I posted some examples for you to get an idea of what I'm talking about. But using just words or just letters, I want you to visually represent these ideas, things like verbs like jump, fall, crash, bounce, burn, all these kind of things, just using type and the placement. Like maybe, if I was going to say dead, if I wanted to express dead with type, I would have maybe the letters would all be laying down like that or something. So it still needs to be readable, but, I really want you to kind of experiment and play around with these ideas. And I don't want you to just, do little doodles on top of your letters to do this. I'm not, if you have a computer, well, obviously you have a computer. If you have a program that you can play around with type and, twist it and turn it and stretch it and do all that, you're welcome to use that. If not, I would almost suggest printing out a page of letters, the whole alphabet that may be, 1 or 2 inches high, and then putting a sheet of paper over top of them and kind of tracing them, so you can play with. So you actually have fonts, and it's not just free drawn, handwriting. But I'll leave that up to you. But I want it to be, block letters that you can play around with and squish and play around with the location of them to really visually represent these words. And take a look at the examples if that doesn't really make sense the way I'm explaining it. So. 5, I want you to pick 5 of those words to visually represent, and then find 3 examples of interesting typography use in advertising or magazine articles, whatever that may be. All right, and I will post your assignments from last week so you can get a look at a few examples, what people are doing. All right, see you later.